James trudged along the cracked pavement outside the neighborhood grocery store, clutching the faded straps of his backpack. His sneakers, worn from months of overuse, shuffled against the ground as he navigated through the parking lot. At 18 years old and fresh out of high school, he had dreams larger than life but a wallet far too small to match. Every penny counted, and his part-time job at the gas station barely kept him afloat. As he finished eating a sandwich he had bought on discount, James noticed an elderly woman standing near the trunk of her car. She was balancing multiple grocery bags, her cane leaning precariously against her hip. Her face, marked with the lines of age and care, shifted between determination and frustration as she struggled to manage the load. Without hesitation, James quickened his pace. "Ma'am, let me help you with that," he offered, dropping his backpack on the ground beside her. The woman looked up, startled but grateful. "Oh, bless you, young man," she said, her voice warm but weary. "I thought I could manage, but these old arms aren't what they used to be." James smiled, taking the bags from her trembling hands. "It's no trouble at all. Let me load these for you." He placed the bags neatly in her trunk and turned back to find her studying him with a curious gaze. "What's your name, dear?" she asked. "James," he replied, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Just trying to help out where I can." "Well, James, I'm Mrs. Edith Clark," she said, offering a handshake. Her hand was cool and soft, the skin paper thin. "You don't see many young folks willing to stop and lend a hand these days. You've done me a real kindness." James shrugged, his cheeks reddening. "It's nothing, really. Glad I could help." Mrs. Clark tilted her head, her expression softening. "Do you live around here?" "Not far," he replied. "Just a few streets over with my mom. I graduated this year and I'm working to save up for college." A flicker of sadness crossed Mrs. Clark's eyes. She leaned lightly on her cane. "College is a wonderful dream. My grandson had big dreams too, but he moved away a long time ago. It gets quiet when you're on your own." James caught the hint of wistfulness in her tone. "Do you have anyone else nearby to help you out?" he asked, suddenly concerned. She smiled faintly but shook her head. "No, it's just me since my husband passed. I manage well enough, but some days are harder than others." The words lingered in the air, making James hesitate. Finally, he blurted out, "If you ever need help with groceries or anything else, I'm around. I could stop by sometime if you'd like." Her face brightened, and for the first time her smile reached her eyes. "Oh, James, that would mean the world to me. You're a kind soul." She pulled a small notepad and pen from her purse and scribbled her address. "Here, come by whenever you have time. I'd love the company." James folded the note carefully into his pocket. "I'll stop by soon, Mrs. Clark." As he walked away, a strange warmth filled his chest. It hadn't been much a few moments to lend a hand, but her gratitude had struck a chord deep within him. 2 days later, James found himself standing in front of a quaint little house surrounded by a neatly trimmed garden. Wildflowers bordered the pathway to the front door, their bright colors a cheerful contrast to the faded paint on the house. He knocked hesitantly, unsure if she'd remember him. The door opened almost immediately. Mrs. Clark stood there, her face lighting up as if she'd been waiting for him. "James, you actually came. Come in, come in." The inside of her home was cozy and filled with knick-knacks, family photos, and bookshelves crammed with worn paperbacks. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. They sat together in her living room, sipping tea she had prepared just for his visit. As they talked, James was surprised by how easily their conversation flowed. She told him stories of her youth, her late husband George, and her grandson who had moved across the country. James found himself sharing his own dreams of studying architecture, his struggles with saving for college, and his part-time job at the gas station. Mrs. Clark listened intently, her eyes sparkling with interest. "You're a hard worker, James. You remind me of George." "Your grandson?" "No," she said with a small chuckle. "My husband. He had big dreams too. Always believed in helping others, no matter what." James smiled. feeling a deep sense of connection. From that day on, he made a habit of visiting Mrs. Clark whenever he could. Sometimes, he helped her tidy the garden or fix small things around the house. Other times, they simply talked for hours, sharing their lives in ways that felt effortless. He hadn't realized how much he looked forward to their chats until one week when work at the gas station kept him too busy to visit. The guilt gnawed at him until he found a free afternoon to stop by. Mrs. Clark opened the door with her usual warm smile, though there was a hint of relief in her eyes. "James, I was starting to think I'd scared you off." "Never, Mrs. Clark," he said with a grin. "Work's just been a bit hectic." She patted his shoulder. "Well, I'm glad you're here now. I just baked cookies. You look like you could use a treat." As he sat with her, munching on cookies and drinking tea, James realized something had shifted in his life. Her company was more than just a pleasant distraction, it was a source of comfort and joy. Similarly, his visit seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders. Neither of them said it out loud, but they had both found something they didn't know they were missing, a connection that spanned generations and gave them both a sense of belonging. Their unlikely friendship was only beginning, and neither could have guessed how deeply it would shape their lives in the months to come. James began visiting Mrs. Clark regularly. Each visit felt like stepping into a little oasis, a world where time slowed down and genuine connection mattered more than anything else. He often arrived in the afternoons, sometimes with small groceries he'd picked up on sale, other times just to sit and chat. One particular visit stood out. James arrived to find Mrs. Clark attempting to fix a squeaky kitchen cabinet, a screwdriver trembling in her hand. "Mrs. Clark, you're going to hurt yourself," James said, quickly stepping in. "Oh, James, it's nothing," she replied, though her cheeks flushed. "I've been meaning to tighten this for ages, but it's harder than I remembered." "Let me take care of it," he said firmly. He grabbed the screwdriver from her and tightened the hinge within minutes. Mrs. Clark smiled warmly. "You're a blessing, James. If George were here, he'd say the same thing." "You've mentioned George a few times," James said, curious. "What was he like?" Her face softened, and she motioned for James to sit at the kitchen table. As they settled in, she began to speak, her voice laced with affection. "George was my husband for 50 years. He loved working with his hands, always building or fixing something. He even built this house when we were first married. He had this way of making everyone around him feel special, like they could do anything." James leaned forward, fascinated by her stories. "Sounds like he was a great guy." "He was," Mrs. Clark said with a wistful smile. "And you remind me of him. Not just because you're handy, but because you care. You've got a good heart, James." The words stayed with him long after he left that evening. Weeks turned into months, and their bond deepened. James began to share more about his own life, his father, who had left when he was young, and how his mom worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Mrs. Clark became a source of encouragement, always reminding him of his potential. "You've got everything it takes to succeed, James," she said one day as they sat on her porch. "It's not just about hard work, though you've got plenty of that. It's about believing in yourself too." James nodded, but the doubt lingered. The costs of college were daunting, and though he'd saved a little, he knew it wasn't enough. He mentioned this to Mrs. Clark once, offhandedly, as they discussed his plans. "Have you applied anywhere yet?" she asked, her brow furrowed in concern. "Not yet," James admitted. "The application fees are expensive, and even if I got in, I'm not sure I could afford it. I've been looking at community colleges to start." Mrs. Clark frowned, her lips pressing together in thought. "You deserve more than that, James. You've got big dreams, and I know you'll make them happen." Her unwavering faith in him was both comforting and daunting. James had never had someone outside his family believe in him so strongly, and it made him even more determined to work harder. One Friday, after finishing his shift at the gas station, James stopped by with a bundle of groceries. Mrs. Clark greeted him with her usual smile, though she seemed quieter than usual. "Mrs. Clark, is everything okay?" James asked, setting the bags on the counter. She hesitated, then sighed. Just one of those days, dear. I was thinking about my grandson Elliot. We used to be so close, but he's been busy with his own life. I don't blame him, of course, but sometimes I miss having family close by. James reached across the counter and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. I'm here, Mrs. Clark. You're not alone. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she patted his hand. Thank you, James. That means more than you know. As the weeks went by, James noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. Though her spirits remained high, she seemed to tire more easily and spent more time resting. Concerned, he began helping with more of the household chores, often arriving unannounced to ensure she wasn't overexerting herself. One day, while folding laundry together, Mrs. Clark said, James, have you ever thought about what you'll do once you've saved enough for college? He shrugged. I'll apply, I guess. I'm not sure where yet. Just wherever I can afford. She nodded thoughtfully. When you do, promise me you won't hold yourself back. You're capable of great things, James. Don't let fear or money stop you. James smiled, though a lump formed in his throat. I promise, Mrs. Clark. Unbeknownst to him, Mrs. Clark had been quietly making plans of her own. She saw in James the same determination and kindness that had once defined her late husband, and she was determined to help him achieve his dreams just as George would have wanted. One bright morning, James arrived at Mrs. Clark's house with a toolbox in hand. Her kitchen faucet had been leaking, and though she insisted it was only a minor drip, James was determined to fix it. Mrs. Clark greeted him at the door, her face lighting up as always. James, you're going to spoil me with all this help, she teased, motioning him inside. Consider it my way of saying thanks for all the tea and cookies, James replied with a grin, heading straight for the kitchen. As James worked under the sink, Mrs. Clark sat at the table, flipping through a stack of papers. She paused, glancing at him thoughtfully. James, she began hesitantly, do you ever think about what it would feel like to reach those big dreams of yours? He tightened a pipe and slid out from under the sink, sitting back on his heels. All the time he admitted, it's what keeps me going. But honestly, it still feels so far away. Some days I wonder if it'll ever happen. Mrs. Clark nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. I know that feeling, she said softly. When George and I first started out, we had nothing but each other and his dreams of building homes. It seemed impossible back then, but step by step, we made it happen. That's the thing about dreams, James, they don't come all at once. You have to build them. James sat back, absorbing her words. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, she said with a small laugh. But it is worth it. And you're worth it too. He smiled, feeling a renewed sense of determination. Thanks, Mrs. Clark. I needed that. Later that week, James stopped by after work, this time bringing his college application materials. He had finally saved enough to apply to a few schools and wanted Mrs. Clark's opinion on his essays. You're asking me for advice, she said, clearly flattered. Of course, James replied. You're one of the smartest people I know. Mrs. Clark chuckled but took the papers seriously, reading them over carefully as James fidgeted in his seat. These are wonderful, she said after a while, setting the papers down. You've written from the heart, and that's what matters most. I have no doubt you'll get in. James felt a rush of relief. I hope so. It's scary though, putting yourself out there like this. Mrs. Clark reached across the table and patted his hand. You're going to do great things, James. I can feel it. A few weeks later, James arrived at her house to share some exciting news. He had been accepted to 2 colleges, one nearby and one out of state. Mrs. Clark's face lit up as she listened to him talk about his options, but when he mentioned the cost, her brow furrowed. I don't want you settling for less, because of money, she said firmly. James sighed. I'll figure it out. Maybe I'll work more hours or apply for more scholarships. It'll take time, but I'll get there. Mrs. Clark didn't say much after that, but James noticed her deep in thought as he spoke. A few days later, James arrived to find her waiting for him with an envelope in her hand. James, I have something for you, she said, her voice steady but emotional. Curious, he took the envelope and opened it, his eyes widening in shock when he saw a check for $5,000. "Mrs. Clark, I can't take this," he said immediately, his voice shaking. "Yes, you can," she said, her tone firm but kind. "This is something I've been planning for a while. George and I saved up over the years, and I want to use some of that money to help you. You're like family to me, James. And family looks out for each other." Tears welled up in James's eyes as he tried to find the words. "This is too much. You've already done so much for me." Mrs. Clark smiled gently. "James, this isn't just about the money. It's about investing in someone I believe in. You have a bright future ahead of you, and I want to see you reach it. Please let me do this." Overwhelmed, James hugged her tightly. "I'll make you proud, Mrs. Clark. I promise." "You already do," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. With Mrs. Clark's support, James was able to accept admission to his dream college. He threw himself into his studies with a renewed sense of purpose, often stopping by her house to share updates and progress. Each time, her pride in him was evident, and their bond grew stronger. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Mrs. Clark turned to him with a soft smile. "James, you're proof that small moments of kindness can change lives. I'm so glad I met you that day in the parking lot." James smiled back, his heart full. "I'm the lucky one, Mrs. Clark. You've changed my life more than I can ever say." Their friendship continued to thrive, a testament to the power of connection and generosity. Both knew they had found something rare and enduring, a bond that would last a lifetime. James worked harder than ever, juggling his studies and a part-time job while maintaining his visits to Mrs. Clark's house. Her support had given him the push he needed to aim higher, and every time he faced challenges, he thought of her faith in him. One rainy evening, James arrived at her house, carrying an umbrella and a folder of sketches for a project he was particularly proud of. Mrs. Clark greeted him with her usual warmth, ushering him inside and handing him a towel to dry off. "You're going to catch a cold if you keep coming out in weather like this," she chided playfully. "I couldn't wait to show you something," James said, spreading the sketches out on her dining table. Mrs. Clark adjusted her glasses, her eyes lighting up as she examined the detailed drawings. "These are incredible, James. This is for one of your classes." "Yeah, it's a design for a community center," he explained. "We had to create something functional but welcoming, and I thought about the things you've told me, how places should feel like home." Mrs. Clark's smile widened. "Oh, James, this is wonderful. You're capturing something so important. George would have loved this." Her mention of George brought a pause to the conversation, both of them reflecting on how much he had inspired their lives. As they shared tea that evening, Mrs. Clark seemed quieter than usual. James noticed the subtle signs, the way she rubbed her hands as if to warm them, the faint tiredness in her voice. "Mrs. Clark, are you sure you're feeling okay?" he asked gently. She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, James, don't you start worrying about me. I'm just getting older, that's all." But James wasn't convinced. Over the next few weeks, he made a point to visit more often, always bringing something to brighten her day, a book he thought she'd like, flowers for her garden, or stories of his latest adventures in college. Her home remained his haven, a place where he could find encouragement and a listening ear, no matter how busy life became. One weekend, Mrs. Clark surprised James by asking him to help her with a special project. She had found an old box of George's belongings in the attic and wanted to sort through them. As they unpacked the box, James found photographs, blueprints, and even a few hand-drawn sketches of houses George had designed but never built. "George always dreamed big," Mrs. Clark said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "He wanted to build homes for people who couldn't afford them, places where they could feel safe and loved." James studied the sketches, struck by their simplicity and warmth. "These are amazing, Mrs. Clark. He must have been incredibly talented." "He was," she said with a proud smile. "And you remind me of him more than you know. That same drive, that same kindness, it's like having a little piece of George here again." The moment was deeply moving for James, who felt honored to be compared to someone so important in her life. As time went on, their friendship continued to flourish. James often thought about the lessons he'd learned from Mrs. Clark: the importance of kindness, resilience, and never losing sight of your dreams. These lessons became his guiding principles, shaping not only his work as a student but also his outlook on life. One evening, as they sat in her living room, Mrs. Clark handed James a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked, puzzled. "Just a little something I've been working on," she said with a twinkle in her eye. Inside was a letter, written in her elegant handwriting. It outlined her hopes for him, her belief in his potential, and her gratitude for the friendship they had shared. "James, I wanted to put this in writing," she explained, "because no matter where life takes you, I want you to know how proud I am of you and how much you've meant to me." James felt his throat tighten as he read her words. "Mrs. Clark, I don't know what to say. You've done so much for me. I don't deserve." "None of that," she interrupted gently. "You've given me something money can't buy: companionship, joy, and the feeling that I'm not alone. That's worth more than anything." James hugged her tightly, the letter still clutched in his hand. As he left her house that night, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the serendipitous meeting that had brought them together. Little did James know, there were still more moments to come that would deepen their bond and forever shape the course of his life. In the weeks that followed, James's visits to Mrs. Clark became even more meaningful. Between his demanding classes and his part-time job, her house remained a sanctuary where he could recharge and be reminded of why he was working so hard. One day, he arrived with exciting news. "Mrs. Clark, guess what? My community center design won first place in my class project competition." Mrs. Clark clasped her hands together, her face lighting up with pride. "Oh, James, that's incredible. I knew you had it in you." He laughed, pulling out the certificate he had received. "It's just a school competition, but it feels like a step forward. Maybe someday I'll actually get to build something like it." "You will," she said with certainty. "You're on your way, James. I can see it." Over the next few months, James began putting more focus into his studies and career aspirations. He started applying for internships, crafting a portfolio, and building connections. Though his visits to Mrs. Clark became slightly less frequent, he made sure they were never far apart. He called her often, updating her on his progress and sharing stories of his successes and challenges. One crisp morning, James stopped by her house with an idea. "Mrs. Clark, do you remember those sketches of George's? The houses he wanted to build?" Her eyes brightened. "Of course. What about them?" "I've been thinking," James said, pulling out a notebook filled with his own designs. "What if I used some of his ideas and incorporated them into my own work? It could be a way to honor his legacy." Tears glistened in Mrs. Clark's eyes as she reached across the table to take his hand. "James, that would mean the world to me. George would be so proud of you." The project became a labor of love for James. Inspired by George's sketches, he created a new portfolio piece that merged functionality with warmth, designing a small neighborhood of affordable homes that prioritized community and connection. When he presented the project to his professors, they were impressed, praising his ingenuity and the emotional depth behind the concept. One professor even suggested submitting it to an architectural competition. James rushed to tell Mrs. Clark the news, her approval always feeling more important than anyone else's. She listened intently, her smile wide as she saw the fire in his eyes. "James, you've done something remarkable. I hope you know that." But what truly struck James was how much Mrs. Clark had done for him. Without her support, her encouragement, wisdom, and generosity, he might never have dared to dream so big. One sunny afternoon, as they sat together in her garden, James turned to her with a determined expression. "Mrs. Clark, when I build my first house, I'm going to dedicate it to you and George. Everything I do will be because of what you've taught me." She laughed softly, brushing a strand of gray hair from her face. "You don't owe me anything, James. All I ever wanted was to see you succeed. That's all the thanks I need." "But I want to," James insisted. "You've changed my life." Mrs. Clark reached out and patted his hand. "You've changed mine too, James. More than you'll ever know." Years later, after James had graduated with honors and begun his career as an architect, he returned to the neighborhood where it all began. He still visited Mrs. Clark, now in her 90s but as sharp and lively as ever. One day he brought her to a plot of land where construction was underway. "Mrs. Clark," he said, gesturing to the partially built house. "This is the first home I'm designing and building independently. And it's in your honor. I named the design the Edith model." Mrs. Clark gasped, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, James, I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever could have imagined." "You deserve it," he said simply. As they stood together, watching workers bring the vision to life, James felt a profound sense of gratitude for the day he had met her. What had started as a small act of kindness had grown into a lifelong bond that had shaped his path in ways he never could have foreseen. And as Mrs. Clark leaned on his arm, smiling brighter than the sun above, James knew that their friendship had been one of the greatest gifts of his life, a bond built on kindness, love, and the belief that even the smallest moments can lead to the most extraordinary things.